Somalia is one of the most famous examples of a failed state, mainly known for its lack of order, chaos, and of course, the pirates. Though it is well known that this country is a failed state, rarely is it actually explained as to how Somalia got to the point where it is now. This video will go over how Somalia went from one of Africa's most prosperous countries to the anarchic dumpster fire it is today, quite frankly, and how a sadism can lead to the collapse of an entire country. Now, before I get into the politics and history that led to Somalia's downfall, it is necessary to cover the demographic and geographic situation with Somalia. Geographically, Somalia is located on the Horn of Africa, as well as that Somalia is made up of mostly flat and very, very dry desert that sees little to no rainfall at all, which means that nothing is grown at all, which means most of it is reliant on either fishing or food imports, which we'll get to in the future down the line here. And with that land, very little of Somalia is actually arable. In terms of demographics, however, Somalia is linguistically homogenous, but there are five major clans due to history and rivalry that make up most of the country. However, the most two important ones that are important to the story of Somalia's collapse are the Darag clan, which makes up most of southern Somalia as well as parts of northeastern Somalia, as well as parts of the Ogaden Plateau, which is very important to Somalia later down the line. And the other important clan is the Azak clan, which makes up most of what is now Somaliland, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Clanism is also a very major part of the Somali identity, with blood ties being the most important. And the ethno-nationalism between these groups, it would eventually go on to shape the acts of a certain someone that we'll get to in a little bit. Now let's get into the very juicy parts of Somalia's colonial history. For its history, it was mainly colonized by the British and the Italians, which colonized what is now Somaliland, and the rest of Somalia in 1884 and 1889 respectively. The reasons why the Italians and the British colonized Somalia was, of course, for its position in the Horn of Africa, and definitely not for its economy, because again, poor farmers, no land at all. And also, in addition, the British just wanted their access to India, but, we get that. And the Italians wanted to secure their colony in Eritrea. However, along with this, the Ethiopians would expand eastward to take the Ogaden Plateau again, which will be important very soon. And this would only divide the Somali people even more. And it would go on to bolster the ideas of Somali irredentism, which, again, that's something we'll get into in a bit. Anyways, the life in both the Italian colony and the British colony were very different. British Somalia, or Somaliland now, was very underdeveloped, as the British only kept it for its position, just for a naval base, and literally nothing else. And also, they were scared later towards the end of the 1800s and the start of the 1900s, where they feared that it'd be destroyed by Muhammad bin Abdullah, who was a leader of a resistance movement within British Somaliland for 30 years. In addition to this, the British had also, as they do, tried to squeeze as much money as they could out of the poor farmers that made up most of Somaliland. The Italian colony, by contrast, had a much better living situation. There were thousands of Italian settlers in Somalia that essentially had very comfortable lives, and the wider native Somali populace was fairly content with their living standards, and this would only be kept under Mussolini's Italy, which is surprising because you consider a fascist power to be, repressive, but, history's not black and white, folks. And also, with this, there were no major rebellions against the Italians during the Italian occupation of Somaliland. Now, let's just quickly fast forward to the end of World War II with Italy's defeat. And the British had taken control of the Italian colony in Somalia in 1941 and would hold it until 1949, in which they would pass it back to Italy with the UN's recognition. And the UN would give the condition to the Italians that they give Somalia independence within 10 years. This 10-year period from 1949 to 1959 would see Somalia as a whole, both the British and Italian zones, go through massive infrastructure, economic, and educational growth. A far cry from, today, but again, that's black and white. We'll get into that. On July 1st, 1960, Somalia would gain independence from Italy, as well as the British, and they would soon unite into one country. Though this unity was not to last, unfortunately. With Somalia's independence in July 1960, at first things within Somalia were not so bad. Somalia had a somewhat functioning democracy with things like free speech, freedom of assembly, etc., etc. In addition to that, women's rights had greatly been boosted, as women freely participated in Somali politics more, and the more conservative views and more Islamic conservative views that you could say were more fringe and not in the mainstream, as well as nationalistic beliefs. Though that, again, I won't last for long, which is, a sentence that keep constantly happening to say in this episode, but you know what, we'll get to it later. Also, in terms of economic growth, it would still continue to rise as agriculture throughout most of Somalia was greatly invested to, which had gently reduced Somalia's reliance on foreign imports for food. And in fact, Somalia became one of the biggest exporters of livestock. But despite all this good stuff, however, there were a lot of major downsides, which would eventually go on to destroy Somalia. Now, where to start? For much of this economic growth that was occurring during this time, it was happening in the southern parts of Somalia, which was the Italian parts of Somalia, and I will be referring to Italian Somalia as South Somalia from now on. And none of this economic growth was really seen in the northern parts of Somalia, which was where the British colony was. Well, this mainly was caused by a colonial legacy left behind by both the British and the Italians, as again, the Italians greatly invested into their colony, whereas the British did not. And in terms of politics, the idea of Greater Somalia, also known as Somali irredentism, was being pushed more and more into the Somalian political mainstream. And now, judging by every authoritarian government that is mostly right-wing, you can see the problems with nationalism, but there's no nationalist government here, and it'll be coming up with a communist government in a bit. In fact, the Somali Republic, and later the Somali Democratic Republic that would come after it, would have to maintain this idea of Somali irredentism in the respective governments in order to maintain their reputation with the people of Somalia. Now, let's just go over what Somali irredentism actually means, because, I've been bringing it up for a bit, and I haven't said what it means, but now here it is. Somali irredentism is the idea that all Somalis should live in one big unified state. This idea would see the Somali government claim land from all of its neighbors. This land would consist of nearly all or half of Djibouti, many sources conclude differently, most of northeastern Kenya, and most importantly to the story, the Ogaden Plateau and eastern Ethiopia. With Ethiopia in particular, proponents of Somali irredentism had a deep fucking hatred for Ethiopia. In addition to this, the nationalist ideas would be pushed more into the mainstream. Somalia's democracy would be constantly plagued by tribal allegiances. 1967 would see the beginning of the end of Somalia's democracy and a path towards anarchy. The 1967 election would see no clear winner, as clan loyalties, of course it fucking did, made it unclear who won the election that year. That being the Democrats or the nationalistic irredentists, who made up basically almost all of the government. 2 years later, in October of 1969, Somali democracy would meet its fucking maker. It all started on the 15th of October 1969, when the bodyguard would kill Somali President Abshirid Shamark. I love these fucking names, by the way. And 6 days later, on the 21st of October 1969, the newly created Supreme Revolutionary Council, or SRC, and the Somali army would overthrow the Somali government. With this coup, the man responsible for Somalia's downfall would come to power. And that man was Major General Siad Barre. And with his rise to power, the Communist Somali Democratic Republic was born. Now, before getting into communist Somalia, let's go over who this Hitler lookalike wannabe was, and for starters, it's going to be a very fitting name, you'll see in a bit. Mohammed Siad Barre, or just Siad Barre, was born sometime in the 1910s in either the Ogaden Plateau in Ethiopia or somewhere in Italian Somalia. It's not very well known. However, what is known about his early life was that he was born into the Mehran clan, which was a subclan of the Durrad. See, I told you those two clans would be important. And more importantly, when he was around 10 years old, the Habirayunis, who were a subclan of the Isaac, remember them? And those people were at war with his clan. And it was during this war that Barre witnessed the violent murder of his father. And this one moment would change Barre, as he would pick up sadistic tendencies as well as a lifelong hatred of the Isaac people, which should go on to propel him to do horrific actions to them later down the line, which we will get to gladly. After witnessing this, Barre would go to Luke, a town in southern Somalia, in the Italian bit, to get a primary education. He would then join the Italian colonial army in its invasion of Ethiopia during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, which you can learn about in a video here. And following the British invasion of Italian Somaliland in 1941, he would join the colonial police, as well as go to Mogadishu to receive a secondary education. And during his time in the colonial police, he would make the rank of chief inspector, which was the highest rank that a native Somali could get in the colonial police, which is pretty impressive, but, that is kind of similar to a certain Ugandan dictator. In 1950, he and some of his later advisors would go to Italy to get military training. And 10 years later, he would join the Somali army, in which he achieved the rank of Major General, and be appointed as Commander-in-Chief of all of the Somali army in 1966. However, it was also during the 1960s that Barre was supposedly gained his communist beliefs from Soviet military officials that were conducting joint military drills with the Somali military. Now that we've gone over this Hitler wannabe, let's see what he did during his rule. The beginning of Barre's rule would see some growth at first. His rule would see Somalia become more industrialized, as well as education become more readily available to much of the Somali populace, as it was not very accessible before his rule. Along with these two things, Barre would nationalize much of Somalia's industries, mainly oil, banking, and agriculture, and also attempted to build around some 30 or 40 communal mills. And to maintain some sense of stability, Barre would implement the Somali Revolutionary Socialist Party, the goal of which was to maintain the support of Somali conservatives by maintaining Islam as the state religion of Somalia, as well as maintaining the support of the communists and scientific socialists. Essentially, he tried to combine both communism and Islam. However, much like the Republic before Barre took power, he would also have to maintain the policy of Somali irredentism, as well as face some of the same problems as the Republic. But in terms of the idea of Somali irredentism, he would actually act upon it, which we'll get to in a bit. And also, despite coming to power on an agenda of supplanting clanism and uniting Somalia as a whole, he really just wanted his clan, the Durrad, to hold most of the power throughout Somalia and stamp out all the other ones. And closely relating to this point, the third problem with his regime was that there was rampant corruption within the Somali government. And because of his authoritarianism and clanism, bribery was rampant within the lower levels of the government. And in addition to this, most of the richest people throughout Somalia just so happened to be Durrads themselves. And finally, his government was very repressive, which, it's not surprising for a communist government. And this repression would only get very much worse as time went on. However, looking outward in terms of his foreign policy, Barre would initially align with the Soviet Union and eventually would go to Moscow to sign a friendship treaty with the Soviets in 1971. And on the other hand, Barre did not have good relations with any of the neighboring countries. Of course he did, because he claimed fucking their territory. Duh. And actually, prior to Barre gaining power in Somalia and Ethiopia had fought a border war between them in 1974. However, that would not be the last conflict between the two countries. And relations between the two countries would break down even further after Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown by the Derg and the Ethiopian military in 1974. And the disorder caused by the Derg coup would see the rise of the Western Somali Liberation Front, WSLF, whose stated goal was to join the Ogaden into Somalia. And upon the rise, Barre would immediately start supporting the WSLF, which the Ethiopian government, now led by its equally bloodthirsty and piece of shit dictator Mengistu Haile Mariam, did not like at all. And despite Mariam's feelings, Barre would still support the WSLF. This issue would only boil over in July 1977. Now, let's finally get into that conflict with the Ogaden that I've been hyping up so much. On the 13th of July 1977, 35,000 Somali soldiers, along with 250 tanks and 40 MiG-21 planes, would thunder across the Ethiopian border. And at first, the Somalis had the upper hand and were gaining a lot of ground in the Ogaden Plateau, and by the end of July, over half of the Ogaden was held by Somali forces. However, their advance would soon be stopped, which could be very much seen in Ukraine today. Hint, 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 hint. Later in September of the same year, the Somali military would capture the town of Jigja, which would cripple the Ethiopian air defense. Jigja, sorry, I cannot pronounce that for the life of me. This city was the site of a major radar station and provided air defense for the Ethiopians. However, despite all this seemingly good success, it would quickly turn around for them. Let's just start. For starters, the Somali military had failed to capture the vital city of Dire Dawa, which was a major logistical hub for Ethiopian forces in the area, and also hosted the second largest airbase in Ethiopia, and also contained the major rail line that Ethiopia had to the Red Sea. Also, the Somalis would be stopped during the Battle of Harar in October 1977, and eventually would see, and even more importantly, nearly every single communist country in the world, except for Romania and China, would back the Ethiopians. And just to keep in mind, the Romanians and the Chinese basically didn't send anything to the Somalis at all. The Soviets had first tried to broker a ceasefire between the two countries in August 1977, which was an endeavor which was greatly rejected by the Somalis, so fucking course it was. And with Barre's refusal for a ceasefire, the Somalis would cut off all support to the Somalis and said it would throw its entire weight behind the Ethiopians. This would come in the form of 1,500 military advisors, and in addition to this, South Yemen, another communist state which I might cover in the future failed states series, would send an additional 2,000 military advisors. In addition to this, the Cubans would send around 1,500 combat troops to the Ethiopians, which would become a major factor in the turning point of the war. In addition to that, the Israelis would also send aircraft and explosives to Ethiopia, though this is mainly due to the fact that Ethiopia was one of the only countries on the continent that actually recognized Israel, and Somalia didn't, because of course it didn't. So in short, this would mean that the Somalis became heavily outmatched and outgunned. And it was also during this time that infighting between the Somali army and the WSLF would start. And this infighting came about as a result of the WSLF becoming resentful of the fact that they weren't getting any of the credit for the fighting that they were doing. And in some situations, the flag of the WSLF was destroyed by Somali forces in favor of their own flag. Which, makes you come to think about a certain conflict going on in Europe right now. Along with this, the Barre government would start to proclaim that all the captured territory would become under the direct control of the Somali government instead of being controlled by the WSLF, which really pissed them the fuck off. However, it was in February 1978 that the Somalis would start to lose the war. A joint Cuban-Ethiopian counterattack would begin, a move that the Somali military was expecting ever since they failed to capture Harar. However, though, the Ethiopians and Cubans would attack with a pincer movement centered around Jigja, which the Somalis didn't expect, and they were pushed off balance. The Cuban and Ethiopian forces would inflict around 6,000 casualties to the Somalis during this attack, and the loss of this battle would see all Somali forces leave Ethiopia by mid-March 1978. Overall, about 6,500 Somali soldiers would be killed during this war, and in addition to that, almost all of Somalia's tanks were destroyed, as well as over half of its air force. Importantly, these were losses that could never ever be rebuilt by the Barre regime. And his vision of Greater Somalia would never come to fruition. And opposition and contempt with Barre's regime would start to build up even more, which would become an important factor in a bit. He would completely sever ties with the Soviets and completely abandon communism as a whole after this war, and he'd start to drift to the United States more and more. The war would also see around 1.3 Somali refugees, most of which were Darads like Barre, and they would cross into Somalia, which would see Somalia's population go from 4 million to 5 million people in a very quick amount of time. This would see Somalia's already meager access to food become even slimmer. But despite all the negatives that these refugees brought, he would find some use for them. Now, as stated in the previous chapter, Baru would completely disavow the Soviets and communism as a whole, and he would continue to side with the United States for the remainder of the Cold War. Baru would meet with, at the time, US President Ronald Reagan, Reaganomics, in 1982. The US government chose to support Baru as he was an enemy of the Soviets, and along with that, the Somalis allowed for the US military to build bases on its territory, which made the power projection of the United States significantly increase in the area. So, essentially the same reason as to why the British and Italians colonized Somalia in the fucking first place. The US government would directly subsidize the Baru regime as well as provide food aid to Somalia all throughout the 1980s, which would... Now, I could just sit here and tell you about Baru's foreign diplomacy throughout this time, but there's one crucial and psychopathic action, frankly, that he would take during this time that would send Somalia into a death spiral towards anarchy. Now, do you recall when I said that Baru hated the Azak clan in the north, in Somaliland, ever since he was 10 years old? Well, starting in the early 1980s, Baru would start to arm much of the Somali refugees, the Darod ones. This is mainly also due to a reaction to the rising support of the Somali National Movement, or SNM, within Somaliland. The SNM was formed because of the increasing repression against the Isaks by the Baru government, as well as the loss of prestige that Baru had suffered at the end of the Ogaden War. And it was also in 1981 that the Somaliland War of Independence would start, in which for most of the war, Baru's forces would completely be fucking wiped out. He, to this, was very furious at the fact that his forces could not contain the rebels and not win at all. And that's when he got the so-called letter of death from his son-in-law, Mohammed Saeed Hersey Morgan, in 1986. In it, Morgan would write, and this is a direct quote, these are not my words, just to hear you out. Anyways, quote, "It has been demonstrated to us unless Quirmies, which I assume in this case is supposed to be some derogatory term, and its supporters are subjected to a campaign of obliteration, there will come a time when they will raise their heads again. But today we possess the right remedy for the virus in the Somali state. It consists of balancing the well-to-do to eliminate the concentration of wealth. The reconstruction of the local council in such a way as to balance its present membership, which is exclusively from a particular people, as well as the dilution of the school population with an infusion of children from the refugee camps in the vicinity of Hargeisa, rendering uninhabitable the territory between the army and the enemy, which can be done by destroying the water tanks and the villages lying across the territory used by them for infiltration, removing from the membership of the armed forces and the civil service all those who are open to suspicion of aiding the enemy, especially those holding sensitive posts. The next year would see the start of the Izlak genocide. 1987 would come to mark two things throughout Somalia. Firstly, it would be the start of Bare's 2-year-long genocide against the Isaks. Secondly, it would mark the beginning of the end of Bare's regime. Womp womp. Though the intended killings of Isak civilians by the Somali military wouldn't occur until at least 1988, Bare would spend most of 1997 ensuring that the Ethiopian government, who had been supporting the SNM during this time, would stop supporting the SNM. His efforts with the Ethiopian government would eventually succeed in April 1988, with the Ethiopian government agreeing to stop funding the SNM. And with this agreement, the SNM would change its strategy to concentrate most of its forces all throughout Somaliland, instead of just the Somali-Ethiopian border like it had been doing. But now that Ethiopia ceased all of its support to the SNM, that would mean that the SNM would have to fight Bare's forces all on their own without any help. And that would not go well for them at first. On May 27, 1988, SNM forces would take and hold the town of Barao, but it would only hold for a few short hours. From the dying hours of the same day on the 27th to the early hours of May 28th, Somali soldiers would retake the town. The soldiers would then massacre the Isak population of Barao. It was reported by the Human Rights Watch that the Somali soldiers had been executing nearly every civilian that they could find, with some soldiers even reportedly breaking into civilian homes to drag out their occupants to be shot in the street. And in some cases, they even used explosive weaponry like heavy artillery and grenade launchers to destroy the city and its people. And its finishing touches would be done by the Somali Air Force 3 days later, when planes would bomb the entirety of Barao and completely destroy it. and this was mainly done by South African and Rhodesian pilots that Bahrain had hired. And also around the same time as this rampage through Barrow, the most infamous part of the Isaac genocide was happening. Somali soldiers stationed in Somaliland's second largest city, Hargeisa, would begin to search house by house to locate SNM fighters, as they feared an attack by the SNM. This was mainly done in response to the SNM attack in Barrow just a few hours earlier. 700 people would be wrongly arrested, and while all the non-Isaks were let go, the Isaks would still be in the custody of the Somali army. The SNM would actually attack Hargeisa on May 31st, with the Somali army retreating out of most parts of the city to prepare a counterattack. And that counterattack would come 2 days later on June 2nd, with the Somali army shelling Hargeisa. This shelling was then followed up by a bombing campaign by the Somali Air Force as well as those pilots that he had hired that I mentioned before. And despite destroying nearly 90% of Hargeisa, the Somali army still wasn't fucking done with the murder of the citizens of Hargeisa, as the Somali soldiers would then round up at least 20 to 30 survivors and execute them as some kind of fucking sick warning. Somali soldiers also on the same days the Barrow and Hargeisa attacks would attack the port of the city of Berbera. Here the Somali army would, without discrepancy, loot and murder the city's inhabitants, with some nomads that were camped outside Berbera being burned alive by the soldiers. And coupled with that, the secret police force, the Hungash, would, like the other massacres happening at the same time, conduct mass arrests of supposed SNM supporters. Though, unlike the massacres before, the SNM hadn't actually attacked the city. Though there were even more examples of the Somali army committing brutal, unwarranted attacks on Isaac civilians, I think you get the fucking idea of it. The Isaac genocide, or the Hargeisa Holocaust, would see mass destruction befall the cities of Hargeisa and Barrow, which I should add were the second and third largest cities all throughout Somalia. In terms of casualties, many sources have different estimates of just how many people were killed during this fucking brutal act of terror. Lower estimates put it around 50,000 people, with some estimates being as high as 200,000 people. In addition, the genocide would displace around 500,000 people. And despite this brutal slaughter, it would not save Bahrain. Speaking of which, let's get into the Civil War. The brutal slaughter of tens of thousands of innocent Azaks would only accelerate the downfall of Bahrain's regime. The U.S. government, now led by President H.W. Bush, would stop any help it was giving to Bahrain. And along with that, most of Somalia's elite class would flee the country, and the Somali government had racked up enormous debts that it could not pay back. The SNM would gain major international support from neighboring countries, and the situation for Bahrain and Somalia as a whole would only tumble further and further when, in late 1989, the United Somali Council, USC, rose up in central Somalia. And it was also in the same year that the newly created Somali Salvation Democratic Front, SSDF, would take control of much of the northeastern part of the country. The next year, in 1990, the Somali Patriotic Movement, SPM, would rise up and take some parts of the southern bit of Somalia. The rebels would work together mostly to take down Bahrain, with them seeing major victories against Bahrain's forces. This would eventually culminate in Bahrain's rule coming to an end on the 27th of January, 1991, with the USC attack on Mogadishu. Bahrain would eventually try to retake power in May 1991, but was ultimately repulsed by the USC. Bahrain would then go on to live in exile in Nigeria for the next 4 years. And he'd eventually meet his stupid fucking face's end on the 2nd of January, 1995. Though that is not the end of the story. Now, since the collapse of his government in 1991, Somalia has been in a state of perpetual civil war ever since. And due to the fact that there are so many different groups that sought to fill the power vacuum left behind by the Bahrain regime, meant that a stable Somali government could not be established all throughout Somalia. Though 2012 did see the creation of a federal government which preaches equality. Though, despite that, Somalia is still a very long ways away to being in a sense of peace. Several factors are the reason as to why Somalia isn't going to have peace anytime soon. Now, where to begin? There's a lot of stuff. Let's just start with some Islamic extremism. There's this group called Al-Shabaab, or in English, Party of the Youth, which has been operating in Somalia since at least the mid-2000s. Though it has fallen far in its power since the mid-2000s, it still remains a major threat to the Somali federal government. And another reason is the dire threats of food security to the millions of people that live in Somalia. In fact, almost half of Somalia's current population has some sort of food security issue, as they don't have access to the little food aid provided by the UN or food that is locally grown within Somalia. Somalia's population mainly still relies on food imports, as, again, Somalia doesn't have nearly enough arable land to sustain 7.1 million people. And this lack of food has only caused more trouble to occur, as food supply access for certain clans is so low. In addition to that, climate change has only served to make this problem even worse, as worse and worse droughts are becoming more common throughout Somalia. And with one occurring at the time of recording just last year in 2022. Although most of Somalia has been swept up by chaos, there's one part of Somalia that's still a bastion of salvation, and that is Somaliland. The unrecognized country of Somaliland is, ironically, the most functional part of the post-Bari Somalia, with it having a currency and actual government that functions well, and a police force to boot. Though the government of Somalia doesn't exactly have the greatest track record. And Somaliland's capital city, Hargeisa, has greatly recovered from the destruction it saw in 1988, though some scars still remain and may not ever heal. Now let's take some time and answer the important question. Does Somalia actually have a good future? Well, the best way I could say is kind of. What I mainly mean is Somalia isn't going to be very stable anytime soon, as in you're not going to wake up and see Somalia is a peaceful land and full of democracy. It won't be like in the state of civil war forever, full of pirates and all that. Some progress has been made, but not at a very fast pace. But eventually, Somalia will crawl out of its destitution, a very broken and scarred country. As for Bahrain, what can be learned from this, or what the dangers of authoritarianism are, and what happens when one man with a very, very big axe to grind has a lot of power. And also, you shouldn't trust people with Hitler mustaches.